I asked the waitress to deliver the divorce letter to the table of my cheating wife and her lover, thinking that no one would ever find out. I imagined the look of horror on her face, the pallor as she unfolded the paper, the brutal impact of the words that would echo in her mind, in her body. And she would have no choice, there would be no more room for excuses, for those lies she kept repeating to herself. I would leave her speechless, with no way out. And so it was. The waitress handed over the envelope with surgical precision. From a distance, I saw her expression turn to dread and despair, a reflection of the abyss that was opening up between us. But that scene was only the beginning. When I got home, the confrontation didn't happen, because I wasn't there anymore. There was nothing else, just the silence of a home that had once been ours, where she, the traitor, would now find herself alone, stripped of any illusion of control. Her world would fall apart piece by piece, and her lover, the one she thought would be the new pillar of her happiness, would soon realize that he wouldn't come out unscathed either. The plan was only just beginning, but it was already enough to make them feel the weight of the consequences. Their betrayal would not go unpunished. Everything they knew and believed would be eroded, turned into a psychological game where I would be the invisible player. They started receiving messages. "The past always comes back," said one of them, which appeared without a sender, a cold, suffocating warning that made them question every decision, every word. They called, looked for answers, but the anguish only increased. The messages continued, "Do you think it ends here?" I knew where I would always find them, every step they took was in my sight, every move was predictable. They were hostages to their own lie. Her lover tried to convince her that it was just a coincidence, a bad joke, but deep down they both knew, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a shadow of something much darker and more real. At work, she noticed different looks. Her boss, her colleagues, everyone seemed to know something she couldn't explain. And then a comment, "I never imagined you'd have the courage." She went pale, trying unsuccessfully to hide her nervousness. The walls of her security were slowly crumbling, and the tension was building every day. She knew that at any moment it could become more public, more obvious, and everything she had always valued, her reputation, her image as an honorable woman, would crumble completely. One evening, when they finally decided to meet in a secluded spot, away from the watchful eyes, another message came through, short and sharp, "You won't escape." The certainty that they were being watched gnawed at each of them in different ways. He, the lover, was beginning to lose patience, his once confident gaze now a mixture of fear and irritation. With each message, with each sign that the past was not buried, he realized that perhaps he was involved in something much deeper than a simple affair. "I can't take it anymore, this has gone too far," he exploded, as she tried in vain to keep control. "Maybe it's someone trying to destroy what we have," she said, more to herself than to him, trying to believe that she still had some power over the situation. But the truth was that they never had any power. Everything was already mapped out, every step they would take was calculated. That marriage she threw away to live out a secret passion was now turning into an endless nightmare, and they were both just pawns. While they tried to find an explanation, I was always at the forefront, manipulating circumstances, scattering the pieces of a puzzle that, for them, would never have a solution. And then, one last message, before a devastating revelation: "Do you really think it ends here? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support betrayal in any form. All the stories are fictional, but they carry an undeniable truth: betrayal destroys lives, breaks bonds and leaves deep scars. Get ready now to hear an impactful story that reveals how every decision has a price." Good story. In the center of New York, in a typical red brick building with large windows and beige linen curtains, lived the couple who would star in a story marked by emotional ups and downs and veiled conflicts. Jonathan and Emily were, in the eyes of many, the picture of a solid union, based on almost 15 years of marriage and a shared history that included everything from passionate trips to the everyday commitments that shape a couple's life. Jonathan, a man of about 43, had a sober appearance, with hair beginning to show signs of gray at the temples, which seemed to make him even more interesting. His posture was discreet, marked by an almost always introspective countenance, typical of those who carry important responsibilities without fanfare. He ran a financial consultancy company that he had painstakingly built up since his early 20s, and devoted most of his time to his work, driven by the desire to provide his family with a comfortable and, above all, secure life. Jonathan's seriousness made him a man who wasn't very fond of spontaneous displays of affection in public. His expressions of love were reserved, careful, and showed in small, almost imperceptible gestures. Emily, on the other hand, was a free spirit. At 38, she displayed a vibrant and captivating energy, her skin always glowing, her blonde hair shining, framing a face of soft but intense expressions. She ran a small art gallery, a job she loved, which allowed her to be surrounded by beauty and creativity every day. Although she had chosen to put aside an academic career to support Jonathan at the beginning of their marriage and, later, to look after their daughter, when she returned to work at the gallery, Emily rediscovered a world that seemed to speak to something deep in her personality, a repressed passion for freedom, for choices, and for exploring new possibilities. They had a teenage daughter, 13-year-old Sophie. An introspective girl, she inherited her father's contemplative gaze, but with a subtlety in her smile that recalled her mother's youthfulness. Sophie was studious and, at the same time, sensitive. She seemed to feel the emotions around her with an intensity unusual for her age. She watched her parents with admiration, but in silence, suspicious that not everything was exactly as it seemed. Sophie's intuition was like a shadow moving through the rooms of the house, picking up nuances in her parents' gestures, their tones of voice and the looks they exchanged. Jonathan and Emily's routine oscillated between intense working days and rare moments of rest together. Jonathan, immersed in the financial world, followed a meticulous, almost mechanical routine. He would wake up early, leave before dawn and only return late at night, exhausted, but always trying to maintain some space for his family. Emily, on the other hand, would start the day with a quiet cup of coffee, sitting at the wooden kitchen table overlooking the small garden she had cultivated in the backyard. While Jonathan kept a strict pace, Emily allowed herself breaks, moments of contemplation that she filled with reading, meditation, or just the pleasure of enjoying a hot drink. The two of them had built a comfortable life, with a house decorated in neutral tones and touches of art hand-picked by Emily. Photographs of their travels, frames hanging on the living room walls and decorative objects they had brought from other parts of the world were silent reminders of lighter times, of a youth when they loved each other with a spontaneity that now seemed to be overshadowed by time and routine. Despite their differences, they maintained a harmonious relationship, or so everyone believed. Jonathan trusted Emily completely and admired her ability to bring life and joy to the house, even at times when he himself seemed distant and consumed by work. Emily, for her part, realized the weight Jonathan was carrying and did her best to lighten his emotional load, offering him understanding and support. Although she felt they lacked a deeper connection, she respected Jonathan's silence, believing that love could also manifest itself in subtle and contained ways. In recent months, however, a quiet restlessness had begun to grow in Emily. She felt increasingly alone, even next to her husband, as if an invisible chasm existed between them. Gradually, this feeling of emptiness became harder to ignore, and the desire to fill the gap consumed her thoughts. In moments of solitary reflection, she wondered if the life she was leading was really the one she wanted for herself, or if she had lost something along the way. As much as she loved Jonathan, Emily longed for something she couldn't describe, a spark, an adventure, perhaps a brief escape from routine. It was as if part of her was asleep, waiting for an impulse, a reason to wake up. Jonathan, for his part, also seemed immersed in thoughts of his own. In the moments when he allowed himself a moment of silence, he pondered what he could do to reconnect with Emily, but he didn't know how to express his feelings. He felt powerless, as if something was stopping him from taking the first step. Sometimes he considered taking her on a trip, perhaps reliving the first years of their marriage, but there was always a reason to put it off, some excuse that he ended up accepting himself, avoiding confronting his own hesitations. The weight of responsibility, the expectation of being the pillar of the family, kept him trapped in his own rigidity. These feelings, however, were like shadows in the background, invisible to everyone around them, but for Jonathan and Emily they became increasingly palpable. Emily, with her keen sensitivity, realized that something had also changed in Jonathan, a detachment that she couldn't understand. And while she tried to divert her thoughts from these worries, she filled the void with her work at the gallery, where she found satisfaction in interacting with the artists and clients, in seeing the art flow around her and remembering, even if briefly, a part of herself that seemed forgotten at home. Jonathan and Emily followed in this silent dance, each too busy to confront the real issues that separated them, each submerged in a version of themselves that the other no longer recognized. Sophie, for her part, observed everything with the curiosity and anguish of a teenager who feels the weight of the adult world without yet understanding its complexities. Sometimes, she saw her father arrive late and touch Emily's shoulder before going upstairs to his room, a gesture of affection that seemed automatic, without the glow she imagined love should have. Family life remained like this, a quiet facade, with no major apparent ruptures. To their neighbors, co-workers and friends, Jonathan and Emily were still the perfect couple, overcoming routine with serenity and grace. But in the depths of each of them, the story was different, an untold narrative of longings and doubts, of hopes mixed with silent fears. As the days went by, Jonathan and Emily moved on together, although each walked a lonely path. He, in his quest to recover what he believed he had lost over the years, without realizing that his own silence and inability to communicate his emotions only increased the distance between them. She, increasingly wrapped up in dreams and daydreams, reflecting on what it meant to be happy, what it meant to be free. Emily was in a unique moment of transformation, where working in the gallery was not just an occupation, but an escape, a way of filling the emptiness she felt in her own life. As the days went by, Jonathan became more and more of a distant figure, trapped in commitments and the exhaustion that seemed to absorb his energy. Emily, on the other hand, channeled her emotions into every painting she saw, every piece of art that passed through her hands, experiencing a wave of freedom and lightness that she had almost forgotten. It was on one of these afternoons, surrounded by vibrant canvases and intense brushstrokes, that Emily met a new client. Thomas was an artist and had a charismatic aura that overflowed in his relaxed way of talking, something that attracted the attention of everyone around him. He was a few years younger than Jonathan, and his naturally affectionate manner contrasted sharply with his husband's reserve. Emily noticed, with a twinge of guilt, how her thoughts ran away from Jonathan when she was around Thomas. She felt more alive, more present, and, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be the center of someone's attention again. Her meetings with Thomas were initially brief, restricted to the gallery environment, where they discussed the exhibitions, the emotion each work conveyed and what might attract customers. However, these moments soon evolved into deeper conversations, dialogues that extended beyond working hours, surrounded by laughter and smiles. Emily knew she was crossing a dangerous line, but the excitement and adrenaline she felt were too intense to ignore. She felt admired and desired again, and with every casual glance or touch, her mind told her to back off, while her heart went forward, surrendered to this new feeling of freedom. Jonathan, oblivious to all this, felt frustrated. The effort to balance work and family was becoming more and more challenging, and he realized that Emily seemed distant, as if a piece of her was beyond his reach. Attempts to get closer became fragile, slipping into uncomfortable silences and her distractions, which now seemed more frequent. Jonathan still had a silent love for her, but he was beginning to feel alone in his own home, unable to understand what had changed between them, unable to directly question what his heart already sensed. One evening, after a long day, Jonathan came home earlier than usual, bringing Emily flowers. He wanted to surprise her, create an opportunity to reconnect and, perhaps, rekindle the affection between them. When he entered, he found the house empty, which was unusual. Sophie was at a friend's house and Emily hadn't left a message. At first, Jonathan thought she might have gone out to sort something out at the gallery, but the doubt bothered him. He looked at his watch and realized that it was too late for Emily to still be at work. He tried to disguise his discomfort, telling himself that he was imagining things. Emily, at that very moment, was sitting in a restaurant next to Thomas, her heart beating fast. Ever since they had started meeting outside the gallery, Emily had been enveloped in a haze of euphoria and fear. They laughed, exchanged intense glances, and she felt that, for the first time in years, someone was truly seeing her layers and unfulfilled desires. She knew it was a betrayal of Jonathan, but at the same time she felt unable to back down. The magnetism between her and Thomas was something she had never felt before, not even in the early years of her marriage. He made her question her own life, her own values, and everything she had ever believed in. That night, after another furtive encounter, Thomas walked her to her car and took her by the hand. Their eyes met, and in a split second, all the tension between them dissipated in a kiss that carried silent promises and repressed desires. Emily, torn between ecstasy and guilt, pulled away quickly, but she knew that that kiss had sealed something between them. Something she wouldn't be able to erase so easily. When she got home, she found Jonathan waiting for her, his face serious. He didn't say anything, just watched her, but Emily could sense the tension in the air. Over the next few days, Jonathan began to notice more signs that something wasn't right. The frequency with which Emily went out without explanation, the way she avoided his direct glances, and even the subtle scent of perfume that wasn't hers on her clothes. He was still reluctant to accept that something might really be going on, but the evidence was piling up. One evening, while Emily was in the shower, Jonathan, in a moment of impulse, picked up her cell phone, feeling guilty before he had even unlocked the screen. He scrolled through the messages and photos, and it was then that he came across a recent exchange between Emily and an unknown number. The conversation was brief, but carried an intimacy he knew well, a tone of complicity that made his heart race. Still without complete confirmation of his suspicions, Jonathan felt a mixture of anguish and anger that he couldn't suppress. He confronted her that very night, without directly revealing what he had read, just saying that he felt she was distant, that something had changed between them. Emily, taken by surprise, tried to downplay the situation, saying that it was just work and tiredness that made her seem more absent, but her eyes betrayed a guilt that Jonathan couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Emily tried in vain to separate the two worlds she had built. Jonathan was her security, the home she always returned to, but Thomas represented a side of herself she had never fully explored, a side that yearned for freedom and passion. The line between right and wrong began to blur with each encounter, until she herself no longer knew where guilt ended and desire began. Until one afternoon, while Emily and Thomas were walking through a secluded park, she felt her phone vibrate. It was a message from Jonathan. He was asking her to dinner that evening, something unusual, but something she knew she couldn't avoid. She felt overwhelmed by a foreboding, a weight that she carried with her for the rest of the meeting, unable to enjoy time with Thomas as usual. When they said goodbye, she gave him a quick kiss, but her mind was already elsewhere. In the evening, when she met Jonathan at the restaurant, Emily noticed that he was particularly serious, distant. She tried to keep the conversation light, but Jonathan's answers were brief, as if he was saving his words for something bigger. At the end of dinner, he took an envelope out of his pocket and placed it in front of her. "I need you to read this, Emily," he said, in a controlled tone, almost too calm. Emily's heart raced, but she took the envelope, trying to control the trembling in her hands. As she opened it and saw the words in front of her, the blood drained from her face. The silence between Jonathan and Emily seemed deafening. The letter, open on the table, was clear, implacable. Emily stood paralyzed, her face pale, her hands trembling as she absorbed the impact of Jonathan's words he had chosen meticulously, with a surgical coldness. She tried to find her voice, something to say, an apology perhaps, but the words failed her, suffocated by the weight of the revelation he had finally imposed between them. Jonathan watched her expressionlessly, the pain carefully buried under a rigid mask. He had been waiting for this moment, this confrontation, and when he saw the dread on Emily's face, he felt a bitter sense of justice. Suddenly, the years of dedication, the nights of sacrifice and silence seemed to take on meaning. "So this is what you chose for us?" His voice was low, but carried an intensity that made her cringe, feeling exposed, vulnerable. Emily looked up, guilt and shame clouding her vision. "Jonathan, she began, but stopped, unable to finish. She knew that any excuse would be empty and that, at that moment, he already knew all the details she had tried to hide. The silence between them was a punishment in itself. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Do you have any idea what went through our daughter's head, Emily? Do you know that Sophie realized what you were doing? Not with words, but with looks, with absences, with the moments when you were here but seemed to be somewhere else." The revelation hit like a bombshell, and Emily felt the shock on her own skin. The idea that Sophie could have felt the tension, or worse, understood it, was unbearable. She covered her face with her hands, her breathing shaky. "I never meant to. I never meant to hurt anyone, Jonathan. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." But her words sounded hollow, even to herself. She knew that the pain she had caused went beyond Jonathan, invading the space of security and comfort that should have been untouchable for Sophie. Jonathan interrupted her, coldly. "Mistakes, Emily, are things that happen unintentionally. What you did was a choice." The last word was almost whispered, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. She felt crushed by the realization of how she had compromised everything she had once valued. And, deep down, she feared even more what he might reveal next. "I didn't plan to expose you like that," he continued, "but what you did, Emily, was beyond what I could forgive. Our daughter now knows that the mother she looked up to, who she saw as an example, chose someone else." The last part came as a blow, a final confirmation that seemed to break Emily in half. She wanted to beg, to scream that she still loved her daughter, but she knew that, in Sophie's mind, that vision had already been shattered. Then Jonathan stood up, picked up his cell phone and placed it in front of her, unlocking a series of messages. "I figured you might deny it, so I gathered the evidence. Not because I needed to know what happened, but so that you understand how clear it was for anyone to see." Emily stared at the screen, her fingers trembling as she read the messages she and Thomas had exchanged. She felt the shame boil up inside her, each word an inescapable proof of the betrayal she had tried to hide, a betrayal that had slowly come to light, destroying any hope she might still have of redemption. The words she had typed now seemed absurd, devoid of any real feeling, reflections of an impulse that no longer made sense. Jonathan continued, his voice harsh. "While you were involved in a game of fleeting emotions, I was here, wondering how we could rebuild something. And that's why I let things take their course, let you make the mistake to the end." He paused, and then the truth came out, a secret that Emily could never have predicted. "Do you think the only one betrayed here was me?" The question was unexpected, and Emily's confusion quickly turned to shock when Jonathan revealed the secret he had kept until that moment. "Do you know who you were dealing with, Emily? Do you think Thomas was just some random artist who came into your life by chance? He knew exactly what he was doing when he approached you. Because, before he was a lover, he was an employee of mine." Emily felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. Her mind couldn't process what Jonathan had just said. "What? How, what do you mean?" Jonathan crossed his arms, keeping his gaze fixed on her. "I hired him to work with me, to help me investigate some financial issues. He had skills, contacts, and, over time, I realized that there was something of interest in him beyond work. It was then that it occurred to me that perhaps he could help me in another way. So, indirectly, I suggested that he meet her." Jonathan paused, and Emily saw the expression on his face, a mixture of hurt and bitterness that she had never seen before. "Do you think he fell in love with you, Emily? Or that it was just chance that made you meet?" "It wasn't chance, or fate. He had a purpose, something you could never have imagined." Jonathan's heavy words carried an irony that cut like a blade, and Emily could barely breathe as she tried to comprehend the extent of what she was hearing. He was paid to get close to you. He was paid so that I could finally see the truth you were hiding. Because, as much as I tried to ignore it, I needed proof. And who better to find it than someone you didn't suspect? The passionate lover you thought you'd found was actually my informant, my ally. Emily choked on her words, feeling the devastating impact of each revelation. Jonathan had manipulated her, used her own vulnerability against her, leading her into a carefully laid trap. Every emotion, every moment when she had believed she was experiencing something unique, now became an empty echo of a farce. The pain and betrayal she thought she had inflicted returned to her with even greater intensity. Jonathan, she managed to stammer, her voice broken, her gaze lost. How could you do that? He stared at her, with implacable coldness. How could I? Emily, it was you who opened this door. I just needed to see through it. You thought you could play with everything we built without there being any consequences. Well, now the consequences are here. The impact of the revelation left her devastated. The whole romance with Thomas had been nothing but a game, a cunning manipulation that she had never suspected. Jonathan had been the architect, the conductor of her own downfall, watching from afar as she sank into illusions, into a false passion that he himself had planted. Trying to find her balance, Emily stood up, tears rolling down her face, her thoughts confused. Everything she had believed over the last few months had been a sham, and the man she thought she knew was now turning out to be a ruthless stranger. She looked at him, searching for some remnant of the love they had once shared, but Jonathan was no longer that man. Now you understand what it means to destroy someone, Emily. Because, while you were getting carried away with your freedom, I was here, falling apart bit by bit. And I just gave you back, on the same level, what you gave me. Now, we're finally balanced. Emily crumbled in silence, aware that by betraying Jonathan, she had betrayed herself even more deeply. And now, there was nothing left. Emily's expression was one of complete devastation, and her mind wandered between disbelief and suffocating despair. That man, with whom she had shared her life, her plans and her dreams, had turned out to be a stranger. Jonathan's words still echoed, turning everything inside her. He had planned every detail, set a cold, calculating trap, and she had been the centerpiece of her own disaster. Jonathan stood in front of her, watching her in silence, as if every second of her suffering was a confirmation of what he thought she deserved. For the first time, Emily realized that Jonathan wasn't just her reserved and devoted husband, he was someone who, when he felt betrayed, turned pain into revenge with a precision she could never have imagined. And as she assimilated this, the weight of the moral dilemma hanging over her became more and more overwhelming. Who was the real villain in this story? That night, Emily could hardly sleep. Her eyes were stinging from the tears that kept falling, and the pain in her chest seemed unbearable. Her mind revisited every moment with Thomas, every time she had believed she had found meaning, freedom. All those memories were now tinged with a deep humiliation. She saw herself as vulnerable, deceived, and the shame was like a burden she carried alone. At dawn, emptiness was the only thing left. Jonathan, on the other hand, remained cold. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened, moving around the house in silence, without a word to Emily. She watched him from afar, feeling the distance between them become a chasm. The figure of the man she had loved became more and more rigid, almost unrecognizable. There was something about them that could never be repaired, an open wound that seemed impossible to heal. And that was destroying her. Over the next few days, Jonathan was impassive, as if everything had gone according to plan and now he could move on. But Emily, watching him in furtive moments, realized that he too was marked. There was something in his eyes, a deep weariness, an emptiness she had never seen before. It was as if, in reaching his goal, he had also lost something essential. And Sophie, his daughter, became the point of tension between them. Emily noticed the way Jonathan spoke to the girl, avoiding mentioning what had happened, but making it clear in his posture, in his harsh, dry words, that something had changed. Sophie, intuitive as ever, picked up on every nuance, and although nothing was said directly, she sensed her mother's suffering in her father's coldness, as if she were living between two opposing forces that she couldn't fully understand. One day, over breakfast, Sophie finally broke the silence. "Why are you two so different?" She looked directly at Jonathan, and he looked away, as if the question had hit him unexpectedly. Emily swallowed, feeling unable to answer. Jonathan, with a heavy sigh, put his cup down on the table and, in a firm tone, said, "Not everything can be explained, Sophie. Some things just change." The answer was vague, but it carried a hidden message, a truth that her daughter was not yet able to fully understand, but already felt. Emily lowered her gaze, unable to face her daughter, afraid that her eyes would reveal the guilt and remorse that were eating her up inside. She knew that, no matter how hard she tried to protect Sophie, this situation had already caused damage. And as Sophie watched her parents in silence, the moral dilemma she herself was beginning to face became clear: who was to blame for the family's ruin? And who should carry the weight of the suffering they now shared? In the days that followed, Emily began to try to reconnect with Jonathan, trying to somehow reverse the damage. But the barrier between them was like an impenetrable wall. He wouldn't give her any opening, any possibility of getting closer. The betrayal and revenge had been consummated, and now there was only emptiness between them. Emily felt like a stranger in her own home, unable to resume the life she had once believed to be safe and stable. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, she approached Jonathan in his home office, where he was spending more and more time. His expression was cold, almost indifferent, as she tried to find the right words to start with. "Jonathan, I know that nothing I say can change what happened, but I need to understand. Why did you choose to destroy everything in this way?" Jonathan remained silent for a few seconds before answering in a low but firm voice, "Because I needed you to feel what I felt, Emily. I needed to make you see what you were doing to me, to our family, in a way that words never could. It was the only way to do justice." She felt the impact of the words, as if each one was a final sentence. "And did that bring you any peace?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. Jonathan hesitated, and for the first time, she saw a small crack in the wall he had erected around himself. "Peace?" He smiled bitterly. "No, Emily, it hasn't brought any peace. But it did bring clarity. I realized that nothing would ever be the same, no matter what I did. So I chose the path that would make you understand. And now I don't know what's left." Emily then realized that Jonathan's revenge had also hurt him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had become a man she no longer recognized, someone she couldn't recognize either. And perhaps that was why she felt that they were both trapped in a tragedy of their own making. The next day, Emily made a decision. She packed a small suitcase and left a letter on the living room table, explaining that she needed some time to herself. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she needed to get away, to try to understand who she was now, after everything. Jonathan found the letter when he got home, and read it with an expression that oscillated between relief and regret. Perhaps he had wanted her to make this decision for a long time, but when he saw the reality in front of him, he felt empty. Sophie, on finding out about her mother's departure, confronted her father with a mixture of anger and sadness. Why did she leave? What happened between you? But Jonathan, trapped in his own grief, was unable to give an answer that would ease his daughter's pain. He just held her, while she cried in his arms, feeling the weight of the separation that had been imposed on her family. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan lived in a silent house, just him and Sophie, in a routine marked by Emily's absence. He realized, over time, that his own quest for justice had left a void that he didn't know how to fill. And although he tried to move on, the echoes of his decision continued to haunt him. Emily was gone, and the silence that remained in the house seemed to echo an almost tangible loneliness. Jonathan, for the first time, was alone with the consequences of his actions, with the emptiness left by revenge. He walked through the rooms with light steps, as if the weight of his own decisions were consuming him little by little. Sophie, in her room, also felt the impact, although she tried in vain to understand what had really happened. For her, her mother's absence was an open wound, an empty space that seemed impossible to fill. In the days that passed, Jonathan tried to start again, but the routine that had once seemed solid was now brittle, full of memories that haunted his thoughts. He had thought that by exposing Emily, by making her suffer the weight of the betrayal, he would find some relief, but he couldn't ignore the pain he had inflicted on himself and his daughter. What remained now was a bitter and inevitable reflection on what he had destroyed and what remained to be rebuilt. Emily, for her part, found refuge in a nearby town, where she rented a small apartment. She led an almost anonymous life, trying to cope with the weight of shame and regret, reflecting on the steps that had led her to that point. All her memories, every moment she had lived with Jonathan, now seemed distant and disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else. But the most painful thing was the absence of Sophie, the daughter she wanted to protect, but who now seemed lost among her parents' choices and mistakes. With no contact with her family, Emily began to rebuild her life in silence, immersing herself in work and new routines, which filled her time but not the emptiness in her heart. As the days went by, she realized that the life she had chosen to live, however fleeting, had destroyed the home she herself had helped to build. In the midst of all this, she missed Sophie, she even missed Jonathan himself, not the man he had become, but the one she had known years ago, before betrayals and lies corrupted the relationship. Sophie, for her part, suffered the most from her mother's departure and her father's estrangement. The teenager closed herself off in a world of her own, where conversations with her parents were replaced by a growing silence. She avoided questioning Jonathan, but her sadness was evident. The few times he tried to approach her, she pushed him away, creating an invisible barrier. Jonathan began to realize the profound impact that his actions, and Emily's, had had on his daughter, and this realization weighed heavily on him, making the guilt unbearable. One day, Jonathan finally plucked up the courage and sat down next to Sophie on the sofa. She looked at him with a blank expression, but he, determined to recover the bond, spoke honestly, trying to explain, albeit without details, what had led to the separation. Sophie listened in silence, but at the end she asked a simple, direct question that shook him to the core: "Why didn't you think of me before you hurt each other?" Her words echoed in Jonathan's heart, and he then realized the extent of his selfishness. He had responded to the betrayal with another betrayal, but the one who had suffered most was his daughter, who now bore the invisible scars of her parents' choices. Jonathan got up and left, unable to face Sophie's gaze. Meanwhile, Emily, still trying to find a way to redeem herself, decided to look for Sophie. Taken by a courage she herself didn't understand, she drove to the old family home, now filled with shadows of a past she had destroyed. When she arrived, she saw Sophie leaving school and approached her daughter. Sophie, on seeing her, hesitated, but allowed her mother to hug her. Emily tried to speak, but Sophie interrupted her. "You knew what you were doing, didn't you? You knew you were hurting us." Emily felt the weight of truth in her daughter's words, and each syllable felt like a sentence. She realized, then, that there was no justification capable of remedying what she had caused, and the only thing she could do was listen to Sophie's outburst. For hours, the two of them walked, talked and cried, and that day, for the first time, Emily realized that her journey to redemption would be long and lonely. After that meeting, Emily went back to trying to rebuild her relationship with her daughter, now aware that the consequences of her actions would follow her forever. Jonathan, for his part, also began to reflect on the need to truly connect with Sophie, and slowly, father and daughter began to find a way to overcome what they had lost. But their relationship would never be the same.